The values of the West, equality before the law, separation of church and state and so forth, are not the products of enlightenment, you claim, but they have much deeper roots. How deep?
Well, they are very deeply rooted, obviously, in our experience, our day-to-day experience, but I think they're also deeply rooted in our history.
Historical roots, yes.
Yeah, and in the traditional authorities from which our sense of community derive, in particular the Hebrew Bible and the Gospels. And I think it's a very important fact that the Gospels were written at a time when there was a universal jurisdiction, the jurisdiction of the
Roman Empire,
of the Roman Empire, and, which was a legal jurisdiction. So the idea of law that you find implicit in the background to the Gospels is an idea of secular law, secular jurisdiction.
The distinction between Caesar and God.
Yes, which is emphasized by Christ in his parable of the tribute money, in which he says, "Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and unto God that which is God's," which has always been taken to imply that our obedience here below is first of all to the secular law, but also in matters spiritual, it is a different kind of obedience, an obedience to the very general principles governing our relationship with God. But the secular law, nevertheless, in some matters, takes precedence.
Yes.
And that is the legacy of that thought can be discerned right through the Dark Ages, through the Middle Ages, right down to the Enlightenment. It becomes more and more explicit at the Enlightenment that that the rule of law is primarily a man-made institution.
Actually, dynastic rulers, even here in Sweden, use exactly that parable in the 16th century to break up the power of the Catholic Church.
Well, there you are. Yes, and I think this particular principle that the rule of law is a secular institution and is in some sense indifferent to religious differences between people, that is a very important achievement, and it lies at the basis of our ethic of toleration. And I think this does contrast radically with the vision that you get from the Quran, in which the law is seen entirely as a God-made thing. It's imposed by God, and the Sharia is an attempt to encapsulate in a set of rules all that has been revealed of God's will through the Quran and through the Sunnah and through those processes which are legitimized in the Quran. And I think this has given rise to a radical ontological division between the heirs of Christian civilization and the heirs of Islamic civilization in the modern world.
Yes. Let's get back to that issue further on, but to stay with the Enlightenment, would you also say that, for example, equality between men and women are not the products of Enlightenment, but have even deeper roots? After all, the Hebrew Bible is a fairly patriarchal text.
Yes, the Hebrew Bible is a patriarchal text, but interestingly enough, it starts off from the very wonderful story of the creation and of Adam and Eve in the garden, in which the natural division between the sexes is both described and legitimized, and at the same time it's made absolutely clear that they are in some deep sense equal. It's not that Adam doesn't have many wives, he has the one wife, Eve, and the relationship between man and woman is seen entirely in dialogue terms. Now, of course, it is true that thereafter, as the Hebrew Bible unfolds, it unfolds as a history of patriarchs. But by the time you've got to the New Testament, that is very much not the prevailing view of what women are.
No.
And indeed, the most important single non-divine human being in the New Testament is Mary. And it's her and her sufferings which became integral to the iconology of sainthood in the Catholic Church.
And then you have the words of Paulus that he's neither Greek or Jew, neither man or woman, but he's everyone in his spirit.
Yes.
I don't know if those are the exact words of this of the James the second Bible, but this is a rough translation from the Swedish.
Right. Yes, I think one can read too much of our modern views back into the Bible.
Is that a risk?
Well, it's always a risk, but after all, it's not a bad thing to read into those texts which you regard as authoritative your own vision of the world, because that doesn't simply rewrite those texts, it rewrites your vision too. It challenges your own vision to see exactly where it has come from and the extent to which it has been endorsed by its predecessors.
So, but if we then turn back to the Muslim civilizations and Islamic cultures, there are Muslim scholars who try to motivate secularism and the division between the affairs of religion and affairs of state, also from the words of the Quran and Hadith and Muslim traditions, which are, I mean, they are trying to adapt, find the roots of an idea which they like in their own tradition.
Yes.
Is that not a fruitful effort from their side, would you say?
I think it is entirely fruitful, and the more that it is done, the better.
But is it hopeless in a sense?
No, it isn't hopeless, but there is a great problem. Well, there are two great problems. The first is that people who speak for the Muslim faith speak without any particular institutional authority. They're always speaking as themselves, and whatever they've been able to achieve by way of endorsement from their congregations.
Which is inherent in the character of the organization of Islam, since Islam never had a pope and bishops and churches.
Yes, exactly. And Islamic law does not recognize institutions in quite the way that our law, being Roman law in origin, does. So that there is a huge institutional problem about who actually speaks for Islam and what is the effect of him speaking for it. But there's another problem, obviously, that the Quran is not supposed to be simply a revelation that has been written down. It is supposed to be the actual word of God, and it is very difficult to reconcile that, therefore, with changes in society which are either not foretold in the Quran or in some way even forbidden by it. And this creates an enormous hermeneutical constraint on what Muslim theologians can say. But of course they still can do this, and I think that is what the real task of theology has always been, to, within the constraints laid down by sacred texts, nevertheless to extract a viable form of life for the human beings who live by those texts.
The Ottoman Muslim scholars in the 16th and 17th century even found a term for it. They called it Hile-i Sharia, which means going past the Sharia, or fooling the Sharia, which was in a way of circumnavigating those constraints that you're talking about.
True, and of course, had it been the case that the Turks had remained, as it were, the leading authorities in the interpretation of the Quran and the leading authorities as the representatives of the faith.
As the Sultan was the Caliph.
Yes, then things would be very different today.
You think so? As the Sultan was the Caliph.
Yes, then things would be very different today.
You think so?
Of course, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire made it possible for those primitive Salafists and the Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia to propose themselves as the authorities.
So I mean, you can say that the withdrawal of the Turkish Republic from all affairs religious when it broke its past with the Ottoman Empire created a vacuum.
That's one way of putting it. Certainly it meant that as far as the interpretation of Islam goes, the Turkish voice is no longer heard.
No.
What is heard are voices that should have been suppressed and would have been suppressed had the Turkish Sultan retained his position. That's not to say that the Turks were wrong to secularize. On the contrary, I think they did the right thing. They Ataturk saved Turkey from otherwise total destruction, and also set it upon the path of modernization, which has made it the successful country that it now is.
To go back to Muslims and Islam and secularism, in the sense that, could you say from another point of view that the interesting thing is not whether Islam is open to secularism and the separation of state and church as Christianity is or not, but the more interesting is whether Muslims can live in secular states and democracies, and in states that promote citizenship before brotherhood and the rule of law before arbitrary decisions. And then if you look up on the world in that sense, obviously the majority of the Muslims in the world can live with that. Then what's the problem, you could say?
Yes, I think that that is right. There are Muslims, and Muslims, of course, some find it easier than others to live with the rules that predominate in our kind of secular jurisdiction. Let me just take some examples. We in Europe don't simply have a secular rule of law. We have very specific laws governing private life. For instance, bigamy is a crime. So you are only allowed to have one wife, and any attempt to evade that law in England in the past has involved very serious punishment. Secondly, compelling people to marry against their will is a crime. And of course, needless to say, things like killing your daughter because she has run off with an unchosen
it's actually a crime in most Muslim societies as well.
I'm sure it is. To the extent that the Muslims can accept these sort of things, then of course there needn't be a contradiction between the secular jurisdiction and their own faith. But many Muslims, especially those coming from places like Somalia and so on, come with a whole battery of customs which are already crimes in our legal systems.
But this is a fairly European point of view of looking on affairs. I mean, we have these problems with immigrants from the outside, but if you consider the larger Muslim countries in the world, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Malaysia, the fourth largest Muslim community in the world, which do not live in a Muslim country, India, in all these countries, those customs we talk about, or these attitude against profane law or secular law, are not that problematic as we see it in Europe when we meet those immigrants that you talked about. Well,
I think that is actually too simple. If you look at the major Islamic communities and societies around the world, you'll find, first of all, that they're all in some ongoing crisis of legitimacy. For instance, just take Egypt. The Muslim Brotherhood, which began in Egypt, began from the thought that secular jurisdiction is a kind of blasphemy, and that until we reconnect ourselves to the not just to the law of God as expressed in the Quran, but also to the traditions of brotherhood as exemplified by the earlier Muslim society, we will not actually be conducting our lives according to the divine commands. And this was taken by the Muslim Brotherhood to authorize a complete rejection of secular order and a violent rejection. Yes. And the Muslim Brotherhood has always been regarded, therefore, as a threat in Egypt. Of course, it's divided into two parts, the part that is regarded as legitimate and the part that is still regarded as criminal. But nevertheless, that criminal side is a very powerful side and feeds into Al-Qaeda, as we know, through various of its leaders. And I think you find all over Malaysia, Pakistan particularly, this sense among many people that the government is somehow illegitimate, precisely because it is trying to rule according to secular principles, and a constant threat to the government, constant assassination attempts, and so on.
But isn't it illegitimate because it's undemocratic? I mean, you don't have the same sense of discussion of illegitimacy in Malaysia and Indonesia.
Why is it undemocratic?
Well, it doesn't. I mean, last time Hosni Mubarak won the elections, he was the last only candidate, and he got 96% of the votes. And Musharraf made a coup d'etat some 10 years ago.
Yeah, but that's a superficial explanation as to why it's
You think so?
Yes, because if that were the case, it would just be isolated and local phenomenon. But the undemocratic nature of the Islamic world is a universal observation. Why? It's because if it becomes democratic, then, of course, gradually the Salafists and so on will take over.
You think so? Most
Then, of course, gradually the Salafists and so on will take over.
You think so? Most Muslims in the world still live in democratic countries. I mean, if you count them by numbers.
Yes, that might be true, but you know, if you're thinking of Turkey and
talking of Indonesia, Malaysia, India.
But you were just telling me that Malaysia is not democratic.
No, Pakistan.
Oh, right. We better go back because I'm now confused.
But if we not more from a polemical point of view, but more from a point of view of if Muslims are able to live with Western values and without regardless of what we think of the ontological problems we have with Islam and versus Christianity, is it possible? Do you think it's possible in the sense that, because you said, well, if they accept some of these?
Yes, I think the critical thing is what will be the attitude towards people who are not Muslims, and also towards people who reject Islam within the community. Are you free to leave the faith? Are people who don't have the faith free to occupy positions in the government or positions in society which bring the best rewards and so on? And I think that is much more important for our vision of secular government than any formal democratic procedures. And that's
problematic.
That is problematic. It is not problematic in Turkey, but of course Turkey ended up at the breakup of the Ottoman Empire as a more or less single faith country. But the Ottomans had developed ways in which Christians could be could enjoy
high positions within the government,
enjoy complete equality before the law with Muslims. But I think you'll find that this is very rare now in the Islamic world, and certainly almost nowhere in the Islamic world can Jews enjoy anything like the privileges of Muslims.
Now, another observation that you made is on the question of irony, which is the correct pronunciation? Irony, by the way. Yeah. So there is a lack of irony in the Quran.
Yes.
There is a lack of irony in the Quran.
Yes.
God does not make jokes, but there is a lack of irony as well in the Hebrew Bible, but not in the Gospels. Do I get you right there?
Yes, I think, well, there is, you know, the Hebrew Bible is a very mixed thing, and it contains extraordinary episodes like the Psalms, which are full of ironical remarks, and also very gentle, flowing, sort of plaintive verses.
But also, I mean, considering the Psalms, but also like the Psalm 137 of crushing your infants against the city walls.
Yes, there's some very, very bloodthirsty and disturbing things in the Old Testament. But all I wanted to emphasize in what I said yesterday is that among the most influential of the passages in the Gospels which formed our vision are straightforwardly ironical passages.
Could you give an example?
Well, my favorite example is that of Christ's response to the woman taken in adultery, who was sentenced to be stoned to death. And they asked his opinion. He said, "Let he who is without fault cast the first stone," you know, which is a wonderfully ironical way of reminding people that they too have done this, that she has been accused of, and it's a way of saying, stand outside yourself for a moment.
Introspection.
Yes, and look at yourself from outside and see what a figure you're making. And then, although he in no way was endorsing what the woman had done or saying that her punishment wasn't in some way deserved, he was also nevertheless putting people in the position where they could no longer carry out that punishment because they recognized indeed the normality and the naturalness of human imperfection. And there's a kind of joke there. And you find that in the Sermon on the Mount and all through the remarks actually attributed to Christ, this spirit of gentle irony, of standing outside the human predicament and telling people not to take themselves so seriously.
Is it due to that the Gospel writers actually are Hellenized in a sense,
Well,
or a part of a larger cultural context than just the Hebrew tribe and its relations to their God.
Yes, absolutely. It's obviously, a Christian would see this simply as the way in which God is reminding us that we are, that we mustn't usurp His position. But a secular or atheistical approach to the Bible would say, yes, of course, that the way to explain this is that this is a teacher arising within the Jewish community who is responding to the wider influences coming from the Roman Empire and, of course, from the distant impact of Greek philosophy.
Well, regardless of which view is the correct one, still we do have irony.
Yes.
And irony, which in a way, where a premise of this is introspection, and introspection is also in a way of self-criticism.
Yeah.
Is that what makes the West strong, an ability to ironize and to look upon yourself from the outside?
I think it's a very important feature, maybe not of our strength, but at least of our sustainability. That conflicts don't have a tendency to escalate to the point of mutual destruction.
No.
People do have a tendency to live with their neighbours on terms. They do have a tendency to compromise and not to expect absolute obedience to some impossible command. And do, on the whole, accept the defects of humanity and regard it still as possible to love. And these are very important gifts, which I think do come to us originally from the Gospels and have enabled Western societies to treat their crises in a much more flexible spirit.
Would you say that the lack of irony in the Quran is an impediment for the Muslim world in that sense? Well,
I think, yes. I think if we go back to the beginnings, in the early years of Islam, of course, it took itself very seriously because it had to. It was in a survival mode and took itself seriously enough to expand. But of course, then
also a conquest mode.
Yes,
you could say.
Yeah, of course. But then, as soon as the pressure was off, as is natural to human beings, a culture began to grow, a very important culture, which is full of the spirit of irony.
Yeah, because that's actually what I was coming to as well. Though the Quran or the Hebrew Bible might lack irony, you can still develop.
Of course.
You have I mean, documented Jewish irony and Jewish humor,
yes.
and also, like for example, Omar Khayyam is a very
I was
ironic.
just going to mention that the Sufi poets of Persia, Hafiz, Omar Khayyam, and Rumi, of course.
Yes, and the tales of Mullah Nasruddin.
Yes, and the 1001 Nights. That's one big exercise, in irony, one great joke told by a woman. But of course, you can travel the Islamic world today and not find a copy of 1001 Nights except fragments.
And Omar Khayyam is more or less forbidden
yes.
in Iran,
yeah.
which is an irony itself.
Yes, but this is partly because of the retreat back to the Quran, not seeing it through the great veil of culture, which previous generations of Muslims have had the advantage of.
So, but it would still be possible from a practical point of view to have a renaissance of these Muslim cultural traits as well.
Yes, but it has to come from within the Muslim world.
No,
we can't
no.
impose it. But I agree, it would be wonderful if there were a renaissance. Isn't
it ironical at the same time, now talking about irony, that most of these manifestations of Muslim irony and humor were documented and saved by Western scholars?
Well, yes, of course. It's not. That's true of Islamic culture in India too. I mean, it was Sir William Jones, the judge, who went there in the late 18th century. He went there with the desire to save what he could of the Muslim culture from
at
destruction.
the same time as Saudi Arabian influences from Wahhabism were destroying them.
Exactly. It was precisely the rumours coming out of Saudi Arabia that alerted people like Jones to the need to take some action.
So, in a way, how is our understanding in the West of these universal values today, and our ability to defend them, you could say?
Well, you know, we live in a time of excessive luxury and in which people can relax and think there's no need to defend anything. It'll just defend itself, and if we fall on hard times, the state will provide for us, and so on. So we live with a very weakened sense of community and a weakened sense of what binds us to each other. But of course there are threats growing, as we all know, and threats have a very powerful effect on the human corporate sense. They're the things that make people look for what binds them together and what they share with their neighbours. And I suspect that people will become more and more aware of these Western values and also the institutional achievements of our societies, and more inclined to defend them and to make explicit what is contained in them.
Would that really be the developmental path, or would we also turn into tribalism and feelings of brotherhood? I mean, when you and feelings of brotherhood. I mean, when you meet an opposition that claims to be a brotherhood, it's not necessary that your reaction will be to uphold universal values, but to go back to your own
brotherhood.
Yes.
That would be so if we had ever really had the idea of brotherhood, but the only time it has burst into the political arena in Europe was at the French Revolution, you know, liberté, égalité, fraternité,
yes.
And it led immediately to 2 million deaths. You know,
yes,
and I think that
the
people,
Napoleon Wars.
Yes, yeah, I think that people on the whole are pretty suspicious of the idea of brotherhood.
But there is another type of brotherhood which is not spelled brotherhood, but is spelled nationalism.
Yes, well, nationalism isn't one thing.
No.
You know, the Swedish nationalism, if there were such a thing, would be,
there is.
Yes, it'd be a sense that, you know, that our language, our country, these things have an identity and a form of belonging. We exist here by right, a right fought for by our ancestors as well. And we have a way of life, a way of dealing with each other, a form of neighbourliness, and these are goods, and let's hang on to them. And that's a gentle form of nationalism.
And maybe with an openness. If you wish to partake in it,
yes,
you're welcome.
You're welcome,
yes.
But you have to obey the rules. And that's I think, on the whole, is how Europeans experience nationhood. Of course, there are deep and atavistic feelings which are connected with language and history and religion, but over the centuries, we've learned how to contain those feelings within institutions and within customs which are non-threatening.
You've written about the orthodoxy of nihilism, in a way, that phrase that you coined, which for me seems to contain some type of critic of postmodernity of anything goes, that there are no objective truths, there are only your values and my values. We can only deconstruct them. Are these threats to the uphold?
Yes, I think that this is the principal threat to Western societies, actually, that as you said, nihilism becomes an orthodoxy, and that people who stand up for things or who express loyalties, affections and commitments of an old-fashioned kind become mocked. They're immediately regarded as somehow ridiculous and outside the fold of normal human society.
How did we come to that point? Maybe that's another interview. But
I wish I knew. I think I've seen it very much led from the front by the intellectuals. You know, 1968 in Paris, where I became conscious of the fact that I disagreed with most of the things that were happening. That was very obviously a nihilistic movement led by first of all, by intellectuals like Foucault, Althusser, Sartre, and so on, by students looking for a way of repudiating the obligations of growing up. It was a kind of refusal to grow up. Growing up is painful. It involves standing on your own and taking responsibility for your life. And by repudiating bourgeois society, you seem to have got rid of the need to do that. I think that has been... that was one first early instance of what we're now living through, and it has a lot to do with what I was referring to earlier, which is the excessive luxury of modern life.
But that luxury is unavoidable. I mean, you're not. Nobody is nobody's telling us that we should go back to harsher times.
Aren't they? I'm telling you.
Harsher times also means higher rates of death of infants.
Yes, there are a lot of bad things about harsher times, but there are some good things. And one particular good thing is that young people are forced to grow up and take responsibility for their own survival, and then the need to love someone and to form a family and to form a protective thing around yourself is so much greater. You
can't do that in an environment of material affluence, is that?
Oh, you can.
If you are responsible.
Yes, but it's harder. An affluent society is one which is replete with temptations. And ours, ultimately, that's what postmodernism is. It's the philosophy of temptation. And it's a way of just giving way to whatever appeals to you.
But in a sense that, considering that most people probably would not like to go back to harsher times, yours seems to be a stillborn project in a sense.
I wasn't saying it's a project. I'm a philosopher. I'm telling you what's true, not what you can do.
Isn't that itself a problem?
Well, not really.
That the philosophers have explained the world, but not been able to change it, to quote...
Yeah, but one has to be a little bit more modest. I think people who set out to change the world always make it worse.
They usually do, don't they?
But a more modest proposal is the one that I have always engaged in, which is just to understand the world and make the small adjustments that you can in the local arena, which is yours.
Yes. So the local arena is very much, at least the European cultural sphere for you. And in a way, it means that going back to Western values and would be to accept at least their universality, would that be the first step in a sense that...
Yes, this is a very difficult question. Universal values only make sense in a very specific context. This is the problem. And the attempt to actually to universalize them and project them or impose them on everyone just leads to their appropriation by sinister forces, as we've seen so many times. I think insofar as there is a lesson taught by history, it is that small-scale, modest, unassuming, self-correcting things are better. And they have to be local, limited, and even if they're inspired by universal values, they shouldn't have the ambition to impose those values on everyone.
Do we have that capacity in Europe? After all, we are fairly small communities.
Yes, I think we have, and I think that we Northern Europeans have shown a remarkable ability to do it. The Swedes, the Norwegians, the Finns, when allowed by the Russians, and the English and the Scots and the Welsh and even the Irish, we have all developed systems of law and neighbourliness which have enabled us to live quite happily within our borders.
And now this is threatened from the inside, more than the outside.
It is threatened, of course, by immigrant communities that don't accept the legal order.
But they are so small.
These are small, but you know, in the city of Malmö, for instance, you have a big problem.
Yeah, we do. Yes.
And so do we in Bradford. That's one threat, but of course there's the threat from the European Union of swamping our legal order with meaningless regulations which have no legitimacy in the eyes of the people, and that is another problem.
So we go back to the old saying of small is beautiful.
Small is okay. I wouldn't go as far as to say it's beautiful.
That was a very philosophical answer.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, you're welcome.